the webinar. A very warm welcome to everyone here today. And so I welcome everyone to our session here on our exploration and qualitative methods here. And my name is Ivana Radovojevic. I'm the project manager with ATLAS.ti, and I'm very pleased to be here today to introduce this series of webinars that are organized by the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, and sponsored by ATLAS.ti, a software for qualitative data analysis. Now, the overarching objective of this webinar series is to offer insights into innovative approaches and practices in qualitative data analysis with ATLAS.ti and with qualitative methods in general. And we strongly believe that sponsoring this initiative can help reach people all around the world and democratize knowledge and help researchers by providing these sessions for free. And so I also want to express my gratitude to Professor Emmerta Karen Olsen, who came to us several years ago with this brilliant idea to launch this project. And so without any further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to the leader of the International Qualitative Research Toolkit, Professor Olsen.
Thank you very much. I would certainly like to welcome you to this session. I'm Karen Olsen. I am based at the International Qualitative Research Network at University of British Columbia, Okanagan campus. I respectfully acknowledge the Syilx Okanagan Nation and their peoples, on whose traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory UBC Okanagan is situated. I would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Our presenter today is Amir Michalovich, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia. He has used ATLAS.ti for more than 5 years, conducting mixed methods in qualitative research, spanning different methodological approaches and methods of analysis, including thematic analysis, content analysis, and discourse analysis. At UBC, he has been providing workshops and consultations on computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, also known as CACTUS, for students, faculty, and staff since 2018. He is also leading a mixed methods research project mandated to explore the challenges, needs, and practices of graduate students conducting CACTUS. Amir's dissertation explores digital media production among youth from refugee and migrant backgrounds in a Vancouver secondary school. He previously managed a large-scale educational research project in Israel mandated to introduce a new multilingual education policy and taught English as a foreign language in Israel. He has also worked as a filmmaker with expertise in video and sound editing, producing, screenwriting, and directing, as well as mentoring community-based filmmaking groups, both youth and adults, in Metro Vancouver and Tel Aviv. His research and teaching explore digital literacies, digital media production, and qualitative data analysis. He recently published work in several journals, including Qualitative Inquiry, the Modern Language Journal, TESOL Quarterly, Language and Literacy, International Journal of Social Research Methodology, and Public Understanding of Science. Please join me in welcoming Amir Michalovich.
All right, thank you so much for this very warm welcome. Thank you to the both of you, and thank you also to all the participants in this webinar. Thanks for joining, and I'm glad that you're here to kind of share with you some of my ideas around multimodal thematic analysis, specifically in ATLAS.ti. So yeah, I don't have to introduce my name. I can just remind you I'm a doctoral candidate currently situated in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia, the Vancouver campus. And in today's presentation, I will talk about an empirically based extension that I'm trying to propose to Brown and Clark's reflexive thematic analysis, otherwise known as TA, to the analysis of multimodal data in ATLAS.ti. And I'll share that model or that extension based on systematic and detailed documentation of the analysis process that I've conducted in a multi-year, multimodal ethnographic study. I'll be presenting a model of inductive and reflexive multimodal thematic analysis, or MTA, in ATLAS.ti. So let's begin. All right, so just to give you a bit of an introduction to kind of situate this work in a certain body of literature, or even several bodies of literature, with the increased possibilities of directly analyzing audio, video, image, and various other kinds of data that are not necessarily only linguistic. So not necessarily only relying on linguistic transcripts of such data, then that could be done, for example, in computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software such as CACDAS. So with the increasing possibilities of directly analyzing such data, there is a growing need to better understand how different methodological approaches and methods of analysis could be deployed to analyze multimodal data with such tools. So Subramanian et al. Suggested that the direct analysis of audio and video data is often exploratory, inductive, and especially emergent, with initial phases of the analysis often dedicated to the time-consuming practice of identifying what they called inspectables, so that content in the recordings or transcripts that really needed to be further inspected and reflected upon. However, little is known about the integration with specific methodological approaches, so how to consider such direct analysis across different methodological approaches. That's something that we still don't know that much about. And importantly, the reporting of analytic practices of CACDAS, of computer-assisted qualitative data analysis in journal articles, is unfortunately often limited, usually due to space considerations, right? So we can't really know that much about it unless it's specifically addressed in maybe another kind of publication. And although some researchers have described in detail how multimodal data could be analyzed, their approaches have predominantly been discursive rather than thematic, and rarely operationalized in CACDAS packages. So, thematic approaches tend to focus more on the content, for example, the topics or processes represented in the data, whereas discursive approaches, for example, discourse analysis, tend to focus more on how the content is communicated or represented. And I'm following here Brown and Clark in this argument. So continuing with with this introduction, as a response to that, lack of sufficient understanding of how qualitative data analysis is often conducted with computer software, there has been a growing body of literature that's been emerging to document, to illustrate, and to inform the possible ways in which different methodological approaches and methods of analysis could be operationalized in CACDAS. And those publications have looked at discourse analysis, looked at narrative analysis, grounded theory, thematic content analysis. My aim with this presentation and the publication that I'm currently working on in relation to it is really to add to this body of literature an empirically based model of inductive and reflexive multimodal thematic analysis in ATLAS.ti, and I'll unpack what I mean by that as we continue with the introduction. So what is reflexive thematic analysis? Well, I'll start with talking about thematic analysis more generally. Thematic analysis is, at least among certain folks, certain scholars, is considered to be a foundational and distinctive method of qualitative analysis that was described as such, including a specific set of procedures by Brown and Clark in their very influential 2006 paper. In that extensively referenced article, they proposed 6 consecutive phases for conducting thematic analysis. The first one being familiarization with data set, then moving to coding, generating initial themes, developing and reviewing themes, refining, defining, and naming things, and then writing up. So I won't dive into each and every one of those phases, but I'm happy to return to it if it's something that folks are interested in. But importantly, thematic analysis in their mind particularly is a reflexive, has that reflexive component. And they do consider it one of several types of thematic analysis, right? So there certainly are others, for example, what they call reliability-based thematic analysis, but reflexive thematic analysis really relies on researcher subjectivity as a resource and on meaning and knowledge as partial, as situated, and contextual. What's important also to consider is that although thematic analysis has been described as a method for analyzing almost any kind of data, the procedures proposed by Braun and Clark emanated exclusively from analysis of textual data. So with this presentation, I hope to extend their set of procedures to the analysis of multimodal data in the context of, specifically in the context of a multimodal ethnographic study. And here we come to ask, what is multimodal ethnography in the first place? So multimodal ethnography is a methodological approach that integrates the focus of multimodal social semiotic research, right, which kind of focuses on the meanings made in artifacts through multiple modes of meaning making, for example, through languages, through visuals, through sounds, gestures, right, and the combination of those different modes, right? So it's an approach that integrates that focus with the focus of ethnography on the historical, social, and cultural contexts in which those artifacts are produced and the processes that bring them about. So we don't look at artifacts and try to infer, how they were made without taking into account a certain broader understanding of those social and cultural contexts through the tools and considerations and training that we get in ethnographic work, right? So it kind of combines those two areas. And with this presentation, what I hope to do is really to illustrate multimodal thematic analysis in the context of a multimodal ethnographic study, where analysis of thematic patterns of processes was kind of foregrounded across different data types as a foundation for analysis of participant-created artifacts, right? As something that would help explain and interrogate and understand those participant-created artifacts. And to the best of my knowledge, it is the first study to really provide that extensive account of multimodal thematic analysis in ATLAS.ti, especially in the context of a multimodal ethnographic study. So soon I'll give you a bit of context about my study and where I kind of, take this model or these ideas or these insights about multimodal thematic analysis. I'll tell you a little bit about the original study. But before that, I'd like to say a few words about the conceptual framework that's kind of driving my thinking here about qualitative data analysis, about ATLAS, and also about meaning making more generally. So this presentation draws from three complementary conceptual perspectives on qualitative data analysis, on ATLAS, and on multimodal meaning making. The first, relating to qualitative data analysis, I rely here on Maxwell's work, Maxwell and Miller, Maxwell and Schmiel, who have really written about or have kind of tried to understand qualitative data analysis as an interactive rather than a fixed process. So it's not that we come with this design and kind of just implement it, right? Qualitative data analysis is very interactive in that there are various components that, as we go, influence the design and also direct the design in potentially unexpected or emergent directions, right? So QDA is understood as this interactive rather than a fixed process, which often involves at least two major types of strategies that we as qualitative researchers try to kind of work with as we try to explore and understand different relationships in the data. One type of strategy that we often find ourselves looking for are categorizing, or kind of one kind of strategy that we typically employ looking for certain types of relationships is categorizing strategies. When we look for relationships of similarity, we try to look for things that are similar. We decontextualize those pieces of data from their original context. We collect them in codes, and we try to kind of organize them based on their similarity, right? And we often do that by looking at, things that we can kind of organize originally without even diving into the data. We know all these folks or all these pieces of data can be categorized or classified in certain ways, right? So those are more organizational categorizations or organizational codes. And then there are these ideas or these virtual boxes or codes that we collect things into or pieces of data into that we don't necessarily anticipate or could not have anticipated before we began our analysis. And those, according to this typology, are more substantive codes or substantive categories. And then typically what we often do is we try eventually to, if we're working inductively for sure, we eventually try to connect these substantive codes or substantive categories and try to explain them through theoretical codes, through codes that kind of draw from the existing literature in some ways, or maybe, codes that we've developed to kind of enhance that theoretical literature. Of course, if we were to work deductively, working from the top to bottom in terms of, using a certain theoretical framework and looking for ideas in the data, we would likely go the other way and kind of start maybe with more theoretical codes. But the key thing is that one of those types of relationships that we look for as qualitative researchers typically are relationships of similarity. We look for things that are similar and we want to collect them together. But then the interesting point that Maxwell and colleagues have also made is that we also look for connecting strategies. We also employ connecting strategies in qualitative data analysis, looking for relationships of contiguity, things that appear together, things that are connected to each other in meaningful ways. So if we're starting our discourse analysis of teacher talk, for example, we might look at what happens every time after a teacher uses a certain term, right? Maybe if we're doing narrative analysis, we're looking for connections between certain types of structures within texts. Looking for these connections between pieces of data is something that doesn't only characterize, those kinds of more discourse analytic practices or even narrative analysis, but even if we're doing thematic analysis, or even if we started off, categorizing our data, at some point, we might want to look for connections between categories, between concepts, and that too is a form of connecting strategies. So we do often employ those strategies as a second phase as well. But I kind of follow this approach, which, at least in my view, kind of really neatly organizes the types of things that we typically do when we analyze qualitative data. The other conceptual lens that I'm kind of using here is one that I draw quite a lot from when thinking about computer-assisted qualitative data analysis. And that one is, following Christina Silver's work and Wolf and Silver particularly, and Silver and Lewins, who've really talked about the productive cactus practices, often involving an ongoing, iterative, and emergent development and translation of analytic strategies, these general plans that we have for analysis, including analytic tasks, so those tasks that can help us achieve those general plans, those individual steps of analytic actions, into software tactics, into the appropriate tools or constructed combinations of tools, right? It's a translation process. That's what I like about that particular lens. And that translation always has to be driven by the methodological approach, by the analytic strategies that are kind of inspired by that methodological approach, rather than having the software drive the analysis, which may happen if we kind of just get too excited about the software and forget about our methodological approach. And lastly, in this conceptual framework, I rely on a multimodal social semiotic approach to meaning making, which emerged from literacy studies, where I'm originally based in. And that approach really sees representation and communication to be more than about language, and in which language is seen as just one form of communication among other modes such as image, gesture, gaze, posture, and so on. And the important thing is that a multimodal approach to qualitative data analysis really does not prioritize language as a superior mode of representation and communication. It attends to the meanings made in multiple modes of meaning making, including language, and their combinations, and seeks to situate the emergence of those meanings in social processes and cultural contexts. And that's why it connects so well, I would argue, with more ethnographic approaches. I'll tell you a little bit about the context of my study, the study from which I developed these ideas around multimodal thematic analysis. The model that I'll present here was developed from systematic and detailed documentation of analysis processes in a multi-year multimodal ethnographic study. So taking a multimodal ethnographic approach, not like a full-fledged ethnography necessarily. But that documentation was developed for the most part in a reflexive memo in ATLAS.ti, where I recorded reflections from analysis sessions spanning 2 years from 2019 to 2021, and about 75 hours of audio and video data that I analyzed. That original project, this original project that I'm kind of reporting this thinking about analysis from, is a multi-year case study research project with youth from refugee and migrant backgrounds in a secondary school in Western Canada, where I employed participatory video with the students, which basically means that the video making was led by participants to explore real-world issues of their choice. And the study's goal was to make visible the youth's language, literacy, and educational practices, resources, and challenges, and to eventually promote pedagogical practices that will help them develop 21st century literacies as part of their engagement in school learning. These are the kinds of data sources that I use. So audio and computer screen video recordings of all of the production sessions, also video recordings of the screening sessions, field notes that I wrote in ATLAS.ti as memos throughout the data collection process, youth's original footage and their final videos. They made reaction videos, they made video podcasts. It's a whole set of videos that I really enjoyed analyzing. And also formal and informal audio recordings of interviews with youth and teachers. So arguably quite a varied, a range of qualitative data. So in terms of some of the results that I'll present here of that model of multimodal thematic analysis in ATLAS.ti, I'll share that ultimately conducting reflexive thematic analysis in ATLAS.ti inductively as part of a multimodal ethnographic approach led to modifications that I made, slight modifications to Brown and Clark's 6-phased approach that I described in the next slide as a model. What I'd like to say is that the model is presented as an organizing structure developed from the extensive analytic processes which could support researchers conducting reflexive TA. But it is not assumed at any point that this model is the only possible mode of reflexive multimodal thematic analysis or the ultimate model. It was really developed to advance researchers' understanding of how MTA can be operationalized in Cognitive software against the backdrop of a gap in this area. The model is followed by an illustration of the analytic processes in the multi-year multimodal ethnographic study. I'll present some of these in a moment. All right, so analysis of multimodal ethnographic data, which was rich and extensive, necessitated more than one round across the 6 analytic phases, if you remember, that Brown and Clark kind of wrote about, and those were, things like getting familiarized with the data and then moving to coding, et cetera, right? So more than one round across those 6 analytic phases. And these rounds really comprised the suggested models, those 3 rounds that I'll share with you, they really comprise the suggested model of multimodal thematic analysis in ATLAS.ti, and I'll go and kind of talk about them one by one. And then I'll share some images from the analysis itself. So multimodal thematic analysis was conducted in the three following distinct rounds, which were recursive and additive, right? So round one was generating a bird's eye view of the data set. Round two was mapping the data from the bottom up. And round three was typically characterized as an excursion into a single thematic cluster each time it happened. Because round three happened more than once. It happened for each of the thematic clusters that were developed previously. So it's actually more than 3 rounds if you really, if you really count the various ones. But I think as 3 types of rounds, we have, essentially 3. And each of those rounds, although I won't explore how in each of those rounds all 6 phases of thematic analysis were followed, but each of those rounds involved those 6 analytic phases suggested by Brown and Clark. And some of them were kind of employed concurrently, as Brown and Clark also suggested it happens sometimes even with textual data. So the first round of analysis involved the classification and review of the entire data set in the original form of the data. So textual data, audio data, video data, whatever its form took, right? A very careful review of it. And as I reviewed the data, also I managed and, and kind of wrote a lot in an extensive reflection memo in ATLAS.ti, and which I then also inductively coded. Okay, I coded that memo. I also coded the textual field notes that I had in that ATLAS.ti project from the data collection process. And just kind of doing that work of reviewing data, all of the data, writing in a reflective memo, analyzing, that is coding that memo, and also coding the field notes in textual form that I had, all of that led to a first draft of this bird's eye view report of the potential broad thematic clusters in the data set. Okay, so these analytic strategies associated with that first round were really directed at finding inspectables, as I kind of talked about initially, and they were all led by the general research goal, and to a lesser extent by the original research questions as framed before data collections. Because eventually, as I'll say in a moment, with the next rounds, more specific and distinct research questions were actually redeveloped based on the inductive analysis in late round 2. What I'd like to point out about this particular round is that immersion in as many modes of data representation as were available was particularly important for the multimodal ethnographic approach, as it prevented textual representations from dominating thematic interpretation processes. The second round involved extensive segmenting and coding performed directly on all audio and video data, which were also synced with automated verbatim transcriptions. And then that round also included extensive reflection in a memo and cross-tabulations of coded data to check for the prevalence of thematic clusters and their constituent codes across the data set. So for example, across participants. And that second round ultimately culminated in the revision and enhancement of the bird's eye view report, including development of specific and distinct research questions for each thematic cluster and references to specific and relevant segments of data. All right, the third round was repeated for the development of every distinct report manuscript from a given thematic cluster. But here, just for, just because we were short on time, I'll consider here just one iteration to kind of briefly relate to it. In that third round, a specific thematic cluster, for example, identity positioning, which turned into a manuscript eventually, was explored in depth in collaboration with colleagues. So codes and data segments or quotations in ATLAS.ti were reviewed and interrogated for their capacity to address that focused research question of that thematic cluster, followed by the development of themes and, importantly, a concept map or a network in ATLAS.ti to connect and organize data segments by theme, and eventually a final write-up of the manuscript. So kind of still following those 6 phases of suggested by Braun and Clark. right? So let's explore additional, broad analytic strategies that I conducted as part of this analysis. And then I'll also here give you some examples of what it looked like. So crucial for the first and second rounds of analysis in this model was the segmenting and categorizing of multimodal data. And that involved the coding of quotations or data segments with codes. It involved generating these relationships of similarity between decontextualized data segments. And in that process, text, audio, and video sources, whether it's in the first round or the second round, or also the third round, were all analyzed, reviewed, coded, and retrieved directly in their original form to avoid a sensorial distance effect that Pink wrote about specifically. Arguably, this enhanced my ability to discern the social and cultural contexts and sensorial experiences associated with the development of multimodal artifacts. So, for example, these reaction videos and video podcasts that I earlier mentioned. It really kind of enhanced my ability to understand those contexts that in which the students kind of produce these artifacts, as was really necessary in a multimodal ethnographic approach. And this was typically guided by questions such as what is going on, what meanings are communicated in different modes, and how might my inferences be wrong. And that segmentation really consisted of selecting moments within audio or video footage that had relevance to the study's goal and kind of turning them into quotations, turning them into objects in ATLAS.ti that can be renamed, can be commented on, and connected to other objects. So that's, in my view, by the way, one of the best advantages of ATLAS.ti, having that quotations level. Now, the round 2 coding process, importantly, was noticeably challenging due to the sheer volume of multimodal data, coupled by the open-ended nature of that inductive approach and the multiple possibilities for data segmentation. So the length of the units of coding and the code labels, these are things that I kind of grappled with. But importantly, the analysis of these multimodal types of data involved the use of language as a form of anchorage, if I follow Roland Barthes' concept here. And as an anchorage, this use of language kind of temporarily fixed the meanings of the multimodal information through the analytic gist summaries that I attached as labels to those segments of audio and video data. Right, so the quotations or those data segments in ATLAS.ti of audio or video data were renamed, right, with analytic gist summaries of their content in language. And I also added quotation comments when more interpretive local discussion was warranted. And in that way, these linguistic summaries, arguably, including the ones that I wrote in memos as well, alleviated the analytic challenges of managing the sheer volume of data and supported the tagging and collection of segment and pieces of data into codes and later into themes, generating relationships of similarity between decontextualized data segments. And these analytic gist summaries also allowed for the later review and retrieval of audio video data through text searches of quotations within codes and within the results of various matrix displays in ATLAS.ti. The crucial advantage of multimodal thematic analysis in ATLAS.ti was that the original gist summaries in language were always in a supportive rather than dominating role in interpretation, since they only really acted as these pointers, these anchors that supported the referencing and retrieval of the original audio or video segments. Those audio and video segments were played repeatedly throughout the analysis and well into the write-up phase, which really allowed data to always be considered in their original multimodal form, as again warranted by a multimodal ethnographic approach. And as I mentioned, the analytic memo writing was a really important process that I kind of employed and really writing about my positionality and writing about my relationship with the data, my relationship with students, and also something that I importantly was also coding as part of this work. So overall, identifying relationships of similarity as an overarching analytic strategy was part of all thematic analysis, analytic phases, but it was mostly central in the phases of familiarization, right? Those phases of that Brown and Clark suggested. So familiarization, coding, and generating initial themes through the creation of codes and thematic patterns in each and every round. So now I'd like to just share with you a little bit of what it looked like when we talk about that segmenting and categorizing process of multimodal data. So here's an image from the first round, and particularly from the first phase in that round, familiarization with the data set. What you're looking at here is you're looking at a computer screen video recording that I imported into ATLAS.ti, right? It's blurred to protect the identity of the participants, of course. And you can see here the synced transcript of the computer screen video recording. You can see the audio channel waveform of video recording. So kind of always being able to sort of read what was said, consider the volume or the the waveform, how the audio was represented, but also being able to watch the video, whether it's a recording of a screen or a piece of footage with students in it. Here you can see that document, that particular video recording, was also commented upon, right? I kind of summarized, what was going on in that particular session, which also helped me eventually move to a sort of better understanding of where I can retrieve and find the information and what it was about. And it's a list that can also be filtered by just, searching for certain items, and also, the various documents, the various files in ATLAS.ti were kind of grouped in those various document groups, as you can see here, based on, the week in which they were produced and the data type, and at some point also, the certain video project that was, that was kind of open here. So just to kind of show you another image still with that segment, within that segmenting and categorizing part of multimodal data, right? This is from the second round, still in that phase of familiarizing myself with the data set. So in that second round, when I really wanted to do this kind of bottom up, review and analysis of the entire data set, what I did was essentially, view the recordings. That's one example here, a video recording, which again had the, the transcript kind of linked to it in ATLAS.ti. And I would find those pieces of data that were particularly relevant to the research questions, the broader research questions, or the research goal. And I would summarize what that piece of data was about, giving the gist of it in language, that gist summary that I mentioned, right? And I'm just kind of showing you what it might have looked like in some cases through this pop-up showing the gist summary of that selected quotation, which happens if you hover above certain quotations in ATLAS.ti, right? So these are the quotations themselves, and you can see that codes were applied to these quotations, codes like this organizational code, like student, which student it was, and perhaps more substantive codes like this one, agentive design choices, and another organizational code like good quotes or rich quotes, right, which kind of helps me capture those quotes or those segments of data that are particularly salient. And also notice that each quotation had an ID. Well, each quotation in ATLAS.ti has an ID, so that's kind of nice. And eventually, if you write a memo and you want to sort of map the evidence that you have for a certain claim, then you can say, these are the quotations associated with that particular argument, right? So you just put in their IDs, and you can then kind of search for those quotations very easily later on in the quotations manager. Moving on here to back to the first round to show you a little bit of what that coding process was like, the coding of textual data, right? Because I was coding here my reflections, I was coding the field notes, I was coding my reflexive memo, the review of materials, and you can see here the selected quotations, selected pieces of text, those data segments, and the multiple codes that I applied to one quotation, to each and every one of those quotations. So that idea that you don't apply just one code, you apply multiple codes to each data segment, as you also saw, I think, in the previous slide. And then this is something that I do think is interesting to show. It's still from the first round, but it was at that point where I was trying to generate initial themes. I was trying to figure out, okay, what major thematic clusters I have here in that first round, right, which is very overwhelming? How can I start identifying certain thematic clusters that I can then dive a bit deeper into in follow-up rounds? And what I typically did was whenever I had a reflection in a memo or even in a field note about ideas for certain papers, for certain thematic clusters, for where I could move this analysis to, what it seemed to be leading me to, I would write about it and then I would code it. I would code it to a code called Ideas for Thematic Clusters. And that code eventually included a lot of quotations or a lot of data segments from different field notes, entries, from different memo entries in my review of materials memo. And what I also did was I created this very lengthy comment for that particular code where I started reflecting while I was kind of checking the various quotations, revisiting those quotations and how I summarized them, and try to think, well, where is this leading me? Where can I take this, this kind of analysis in the first round in terms of thinking of major clusters of themes? So I did it in this way through a comment here in ATLAS.ti, a code comment. So now I'll move to my last part here, talking about connecting segments of multimodal data. Then I'll show you a few illustrations of that, and then I'll conclude, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions as well. So crucial for that third round of analysis in the model were connecting strategies, or the establishment of relationships of contiguity, where, for example, decontextualized data were reconnected to show connections between meanings made in participants' artifacts and the contexts and processes that brought them about. This is really what that broad analytic strategy was about, really. So I'll start by saying that analytic and reflexive memos in that round, and in various rounds as well, but particularly in the third round, often including references to specific data segments or quotations, right? By noting the quotation IDs that I kind of mentioned earlier. And those were really easily retrievable through a search in the quotations manager. And that meant that analytic memos that I developed allowed not only for the development of inferences about the data, including reflection on my positionality as a researcher and my relationship with these inferences, but also they allowed for the mapping of easily retrievable specific supporting evidence for those inferences from the broad multimodal ethnographic data set. And this, really helped me in constituting this audit trail of analytic inferences that supported the trustworthiness of the analysis, at least in my view, and I think in others' view as well. Now, another tool that I used for establishing contiguity relationships, specifically between codes from different categories, was typically the code co-occurrence table in ATLAS.ti. I'll show you what it looks like in a moment, which really revealed to me the extent to which codes from different categories were applied together to the same data segments and how they applied together, right? I was able to dive into these co-occurrences and see, what happens when those, two codes kind of overlap or are applied together often or not so often. I'll show you what it looks like in a minute. Now, importantly, the multimodal ethnographic approach that I employed here really necessitated that any analysis of multimodal participant-produced artifacts be situated in the specific social and cultural context in which the artifacts were designed. So in this case, segments of youth's artifacts, right? These quotations from their final videos were connected to segments from interviews and focus groups. In my case, audio file quotations typically, and also to quotations from filmmaking sessions, which were typically video file quotations that helped explain the contexts and processes that brought about those artifacts. And this was done in an interactive concept map called a network in ATLAS.ti, and I'll show you what it looks like and how helpful it was for my analysis. So this concept mapping environment really supported the manual recontextualization of data segments in relationships of contiguity. and the assessment of thematic patterns prevalence across participants. That's through the concept map, but also through the code co-occurrence table that I mentioned earlier. Concept mapping particularly was most central in that third round of analysis. So what did it look like? Well, here's an example, not of the concept map. I'll start by just kind of showing you what it looked like in the second round when I was trying to generate initial themes, when I was trying to see, what kinds of thematic clusters are, maybe emerging from that second round, and how could I update existing thematic patterns or clusters from the first round. So what I did was I collected codes, those typically, for the most part, substantive codes that I had generated, that I could not have anticipated that would be relevant. I collected them in code groups based on those specific thematic patterns that I was identifying. For example, one about the social drama of digital multimodal composing, which is a term or a set of terms more relevant to my area of research. But you can imagine this as a thematic cluster that I'm currently developing into a manuscript. So that's what it looked like. I would collect these relevant codes, right, and into a code group and kind of review them here. I would review how grounded they were, the data that was making up each and every one of those codes, but also how they could be organized within these code groups that I could later more easily retrieve them. And then here, in terms of still connecting those segments of multimodal data, this is an example of a code co-occurrence table that I mentioned earlier on, that like matrix display, where I would basically put these different substantive codes here, specifically pertaining to this thematic cluster. And I typically did that in the developing and reviewing themes phase in the Brown and Clark approach. And in this case, I did it in round 2. So I kind of lined up these different substantive codes and looked at the extent to which they were prevalent across different organizational codes, essentially student codes essentially signaling, the different students, right? So I could see that certain students were particularly, active maybe in relation to a certain code here. And I could also visualize that through the ATLAS.ti Sankey diagram by kind of seeing, how maybe one code was represented across different participants, right? The extent to which it was happening or represented across different participants. And this table, as an interactive table, didn't only show me patterns of prevalence, but it also allowed me to interrogate the data more in depth by just clicking on one of those cells or clicking on one of those areas in the Sankey diagram and exploring the data, the actual pieces of data, the quotations that make up or made up a certain pattern or made up a certain code in this case. And of course, I would be using the just summaries here that I could also search within through this search bar. And that arguably helped me in developing and reviewing themes and seeing connections between students, perhaps, and certain patterns of meaning in the data. In this example, I'm showing you here another code co-occurrence table where in the first round, when I was trying to refine, define, and rename the themes that I was already kind of collecting, those thematic patterns here, those thematic clusters, I would typically sort of line them up also in a code co-occurrence table and look at the good quotes, their overlap with that other code called good quotes or rich quotes, to see what are the most salient quotations or pieces of data, in this case, just my reflections in textual form, that could really help me think further or more deeply about each and every one of those patterns or thematic clusters. And then lastly, the concept map in ATLAS.ti, or the network. I'm showing you here an example from round 3, that point where I was generating initial themes for a very specific manuscript, one thematic cluster. So this concept map comes from that particular thematic cluster, and it's a map of the entire argument, looking at 3 thematic patterns within that cluster that I eventually reported on as 3 thematic patterns in a paper, in a manuscript. And then kind of zooming into just one of them, in that concept map, I would kind of identify particularly important moments in students' videos And I would try to see what are, the things that are really important that the students said about that, design decision in the video, or that their teachers said about it. What are the, moments from the process that I could maybe use here to kind of explain those design choices, right? So through that concept map, I was able to show and create connections between those design, choices, those particular parts of the students' videos, and the things that kind of led to their development, right? The things that brought them about from the social and cultural context that I was able to document through these video recordings, screen recordings, etc. All right, so just to kind of conclude, in this presentation, I wanted to show you how reflexive thematic analysis could be extended to the multimodal ethnographic realm. That particular reflexive thematic analysis is laid out by Braun and Clark. And I wanted to show you that in that process of extension, I'm trying to propose that the previously suggested phases can be useful when repeated in at least 3 distinct recursive and additive rounds of analysis, that the direct analysis of audio and video is helpful for maintaining a close connection to the sensory quality of the data, but that for categorizing, for retrieving, and for connecting techniques in ATLAS.ti, or probably in CACTAS more generally, researchers can really benefit from attaching analytic gist summaries in language to such data. And the argument is that the combination of those gist summaries in language for quick retrieval of data segments, like in memos and in cross-tabulations of data, and the ability to immediately play the segments from different software spaces makes this process uniquely suitable for enhancing the trustworthiness of analysis through those audit trails, and for reflexive approaches to thematic analysis, which require close documentation of researcher positioning in data interpretation. Lastly, I propose that the relationship of similarity and contiguity that I kind of tried to convey here play crucial parts in different rounds of multimodal thematic analysis in CACTAS software, particularly in this case in ATLAS.ti. In the first and particularly second rounds, categorizing strategies may be essential before connecting strategies are employed, especially because of the need to examine inspectables before in-depth analysis is undertaken. And this is especially true for a multimodal ethnographic approach, which directs researchers to ground multimodal participant-produced artifacts in their social and cultural context and processes. With that, I'll wrap the kind of very instructional part of the presentation, and I'll be happy to take any questions you might have, any thoughts. Thank you all for hanging in there for, 50 minutes, 45 minutes. All right. Well, these are some references. I can share them later.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
We have one question in the chat about, I'm getting quite a bit of feedback here. I'm not sure why.
Let me mute myself. It might be related.
Okay, let's try again. There's been a request for some articles on best practices in analyzing video with ATLAS.ti, and asks that you write some, or maybe you already have. Would you comment on that, please?
Thank you for that question or comment. I am working on this. So this presentation is based on this led to a paper that's currently under review. And hopefully will be published soon. So that's one source that hopefully you'll be able to use soon. But the reference list that I'll share here that I think will be accessible to folks after today's presentation will also, I think, be useful. Maybe not in providing all of that information in one place, but could perhaps guide you to check certain practices, maybe not best practices, but what people have written about this previously. So that could help you navigate that realm as well. But I'm happy to, if you want to follow up with me, if you got questions relating to your particular situation, I'm happy to give you my 2 cents based on my analysis of video in my study. So hopefully that helps feel free to let me know if you have any follow-up question.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? I don't see any other questions in the chat yet. But I'll ask one, and I'm speaking now as a journal editor. So we always ask people to talk about what their design is, and we repeatedly get articles where people say their design is content analysis. But I appreciated you saying very specifically that content analysis isn't a design, it's an analytic strategy that can go with lots of different designs. So you've used it in this study in an ethnography. Are there other designs that you think this approach would be particularly useful for?
That's a good question. I think that certainly if I were to employ a methodological approach, for example, such as grounded theory, for example, it's a question whether you would, call that design or a methodological approach, but I'll focus on methodological approaches because I think that sometimes there will be interesting differences there with, methodological approaches like grounded theory, for example. I think there might be things that could be very similar to what I did, I would argue. Though, of course, there would be things more specific to grounded theory that would have to be developed, right? Things that I have not followed here, various things related to grounded theory. But there are certain methodological approaches that would probably look very different than what I did. And I'm thinking especially about like discourse analytic work, for example, looking at careful analysis of video data or audio data, conversational analysis for sure, right? That would look very different, I would say. I would dare to say, I'm not sure, but I think it would look very different from what I did. That's when I look at methodological approaches. In terms of design, I feel like this study was mostly, it's based on case study research design. That's kind of what I followed. So I think that if you were to look at other kinds of designs, other kinds of, more broader designs, then you may end up with something a little bit different potentially. Yeah, but it's hard to say. I think that what's really important with these kinds of contributions is to really provide the space in journals and presentations to talk about how these approaches might look differently in different designs and different methodological approaches. Because I think that's something that's not sufficiently available for students, for example, just starting to learn about different designs and different methodological approaches and how to operationalize them. I've seen that time and again in my, wearing my other hat as graduate advisor for students in qualitative data analysis. So I hope that kind of answered the question to a certain extent,
Yes.
but thank you for that. It's a great thing to consider.
Absolutely. And if you're looking for a place to publish methods articles, I would refer you to the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, which has a very great impact factor. We're now over 4, and it's quite remarkable for a social science journal. But there's a lot, I think what it speaks to is that there's a growing interest in methods, like how to do things, because it's so many interesting ideas like multimodal data, like things are moving so fast. You can't rely on textbooks for this anymore. So we're looking forward to those publications very much. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I think I'll hand it back to you, Naringa. And I just want to say, Amir, thanks once again for a great talk.
Thank you, Karen. Much appreciated. Thanks for your wonderful questions. And I look forward to future conversations.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And Amir, yeah, it's a really great presentation. And I'm also really happy to see so much more interest in methods and in qualitative methods as well. I think that with everything that's going on in the world, there's sort of this awakening in the importance of doing this kind of research. And so, yeah, it's great to see that this is being supported. And yeah, definitely I wish you all the best with moving this forward. And so, well, with that, I just want to, yeah, thank you for this insightful presentation, Amir. Yeah, it was very inspirational, certainly got me thinking. And I hope that everyone else also perhaps got some ideas for their own research projects. And then I also, just to close up, I wanted to share a few words with the audience, just in case any of you are interested in learning about ATLAS.ti. We have a huge variety of free webinars on qualitative analysis and literature reviews and different applications or uses of ATLAS.ti. So you can certainly explore that. And as well, since you're all participating here today, you can all count on a special discount for any trainings of ATLAS.ti or any licenses for the software. Feel free to send an email to training@atlas.ti.com, letting us know you attended the webinar, and we'd be more than happy to send that discount over. And so just thank you once again to Professor Karen Olson for this session, and to our great presenter, Amir, for the opportunity to learn from you. And last but not least, I thank all of you, our dear participants, for joining us here today. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up for now, but certainly, feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions. And I see a lot of great comments now here in the chat, so thanks everyone. I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed it. And yeah, and thank you, Amir. And so feel free to reach out if you ever have any other questions or comments. And well, other than that, I just want to wish everyone a great rest of the day and all the best in your qualitative research journeys.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ivana. Take care.
Bye. Thanks.